Thank you for giving me the opportunity to spend some time with you discussing an important topic. In this presentation, I will touch on recent developments pertaining to ESG disclosure requirements with a particular focus on greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. Next, I'll highlight insights from a couple of research projects that my co-authors and I have in this space. And finally, I'll conclude with some questions for future research that I believe will be informative from a policymaking perspective. So, over the past year, we've seen a significant uptick in policymaking activities pertaining to ESG disclosures by regulators and standard setters around the globe. Due to the impending nature of the risks posed by climate change, these policymaking activities, unsurprisingly, have largely focused on disclosures pertaining to climate change. In the SEC's climate proposal released earlier this year, it outlines its rationale for doing so. The SEC states, "We're proposing to require disclosures about climate-related risks and metrics reflecting those risks because this information can have an impact on public companies' financial performance or position." And then the SEC goes on to assert that this impact may be material to investors. Recent research does support the SEC's assertion about the materiality of climate disclosures to investors. For instance, some studies provide evidence of a negative relationship between a company's level of greenhouse gas emissions and its equity value. Other studies also provide evidence of a positive relationship between companies' greenhouse gas emissions and the company's perceived risk. Now, accordingly, these studies suggest that mitigating emissions can therefore increase a company's equity value and reduce its risk perceptions. So these are opportunities that companies can benefit from. However, there are different strategies companies can employ, as well as different types of emissions that they can mitigate to capture these benefits. And this is the space that my co-authors and I have focused on. Specifically, in two studies, we contribute to the existing literature by examining whether and when the strategies companies use that focus on using offsets or mitigate emissions or different types of emissions is relevant to investors. And here's a brief overview of what we find. In the first study, it was a paper in 2020 published in Contemporary Accounting Research. And the question we set out to answer is whether there are value implications for companies choosing operational changes versus purchasing offsets in order to mitigate emissions. And the way that we test this question is that we recruit adults in the United States and we ask them to value a hypothetical company in an experiment. Now, in this experiment, we hold constant the company's financial performance, the company's net emissions, and its investment levels in its emission mitigation strategy. And then we manipulate two variables. The first variable has to do with what the company discloses about its emission mitigation strategy. In one condition, the company doesn't disclose any information. In the second condition, the company discloses that they primarily use operational changes. And then in the third condition, the company primarily purchases offsets. And then the second variable we manipulate is the company's overall ESG performance as assessed by an independent third party. And we manipulate that as either being below or above the industry average. And what we find in this study is that the effect of a company's mitigation strategy on its perceived value is conditional on its overall ESG performance. For instance, when a company's overall ESG performance is above the industry average, we don't detect any statistically significant differences in its perceived value, depending on how or what its mitigation strategy is. However, when the company's overall ESG performance is below the industry average, we find that when a company primarily purchases offsets, its perceived value is significantly lower than when the company doesn't disclose its strategy or discloses that it primarily uses an operations strategy. So one of the key takeaways from this study is that a company's emissions management strategy is relevant to retail investors, and this is particularly the case when its overall ESG performance is relatively poor. So in our second study, we extend the first study by examining whether investors are sensitive to a more subtle difference in emissions mitigation strategy. That is, we test whether and when investors differentiate between mitigating direct Scope 1 emissions compared to indirect Scope 2 emissions. And the way that we test this is very similar to what we did in the first study. We again recruit adults in the United States and ask them to evaluate a hypothetical company. We hold constant the company's financial performance, its net emissions, and its investment level in the emissions mitigation. And then we manipulate two variables. The first one is whether the company produces renewable energy to mitigate emissions, which effectively mitigates its Scope 1 emissions, or whether the company purchases renewable energy to mitigate emissions, which effectively mitigates its Scope 2 emissions. And then again, we also manipulate the company's overall ESG performance as being above or below the industry average. The results of this second study provide further evidence that the effect of a company's mitigation strategy on retail investors is conditional on its overall ESG performance. When the company is above the industry average for overall ESG performance, retail investors are more willing to invest when the company purchases rather than produces renewable energy. However, the opposite is true when the company's overall ESG performance is below the industry average. So a couple of key takeaways from this study is, again, we find additional evidence that emissions management strategies are relevant to retail investors. And further, in this study, we find that not only is emissions management strategy relevant for below average performers, but in this case, we find evidence that it's relevant for above average performers. So, in summary, both of our studies support the SEC's assertion in its climate proposal that climate-related disclosures may be material to investors, and specifically the investment strategy or the mitigation strategy companies use. So far I've talked about companies' efforts to mitigate emissions by reducing Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, or by purchasing offsets. What I'd like to do next is touch on Scope 3 emissions disclosures. Now, Scope 3 often constitutes the largest proportion of companies' absolute emissions, and mitigating these is therefore important not only for companies but also for the planet. However, many companies don't measure or disclose Scope 3 simply because doing so is pretty complicated and therefore costly. So, the cost to measure and disclose Scope 3 creates a tension with the importance of doing so. And this tension provides opportunities for future research, especially considering the recent proposals and standards regarding Scope 3 disclosure.
Joseph, I noticed that the audience is asking questions, and the questions are along the following lines. What are the main differences in disclosure requirements from the various regulators and standard setters pertaining to Scope 3 emissions?
That's a great question. The SEC proposal currently requires companies under its jurisdiction to disclose Scope 3 emissions if material, or if Scope 3 targets and goals are set. The EFRAG, which is the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, requires companies under its jurisdiction to disclose Scope 3 if material. And finally, the ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, recommends companies disclose Scope 3, but if they don't, they should explain why not. So it's currently not clear which of these regimes will allow for alternative reporting using the standards from another regime. Now, in the event that it is allowed, it would be interesting to see if alternative reporting results in strategic framework selection for certain companies, and whether that selection is motivated by economic factors, such as minimizing reporting costs, or the desire to signal private information, such as management's views about climate change. A second interesting question pertains to the SEC's proposal. If enacted as currently stated, SEC registrants would be required to measure and disclose Scope 3 if they set Scope 3 targets and goals, but they may not be required to do so if they don't set those targets and goals. Thus, it would be interesting to see if an unintended consequence of this SEC rule is that it actually discourages target and goal setting for Scope 3, which would resultingly hinder companies' efforts to mitigate these emissions. Another interesting aspect of the standards and rules proposed by these regimes is that disclosure of Scope 1 and 2 emissions is mandatory, whereas disclosure of Scope 3 is conditional. As a result, if a company is not required to disclose Scope 3 emissions, one way it can appear to reduce its total emissions is by outsourcing operations that generate Scope 1 emissions to independent third parties. Doing so is essentially greenwashing in that outsourcing doesn't actually reduce emissions output, but merely shifts them into another reporting category that is hidden from the public eye. And there's already some evidence that such outsourcing exists, as evidenced by this New York Times headline. Thus, the third and final question for future research that I think would be interesting is to examine whether disclosure requirements that mandate measurement and disclosure of scope 1 and 2, but not scope 3, further incentivize and exacerbate emissions outsourcing. So, in conclusion, I wish to make a couple of points to summarize my presentation. First, the existing research supports the idea that not only do investors care about companies' absolute levels of emissions, but they also care about the strategies companies use to reduce their emissions levels. And second, to date, research is primarily focused on scope 1 and 2 emissions. So there's still much we can learn about the materiality of scope 3 emissions, including how the recent disclosure standards and proposals will impact whether and what companies report about scope 3 emissions. Thank you.